Peter Shea here with the 2024 State of the Church update for all of you. The purpose of these annual addresses is to give you an overall assessment of the practical state, the spiritual state, the financial state of our church, and to share with you a little bit of the vision and direction for our future as a Branches community. We're going to look back, and at the same time, we're also going to be looking forward. Our last year's vision was fully devoted. What does it look like to be fully committed disciples of Jesus? And we went through several studies discovering what that means, including True Wealth, a study that we did through the Bible on what it says about money and our use of it, our giving. We went through Searching for Significance, a study through the book of Ecclesiastes. Generosity, a series looking at how we can be givers beyond just the topic of money. And finally, 1 Corinthians, where we went through a litany of topics from everything involving sexuality, gender, marriage, singleness, spiritual gifts, our witness to our culture, and more. These were hard-hitting studies designed to challenge us to grow in our devotion as disciples. And we saw just that result in our community in a variety of different ways. For instance, in response to our series on money, we saw a big jump in our giving, which meant we could make a massive investment in the local faith-based nonprofit, our after-school program, Common Ground, which we helped launch 10 years ago. It was on an average Sunday last fall, we announced we would be giving a gift of $100,000 on top of what we contribute on a monthly basis to help them and enable them to purchase a house in the neighborhood where they're doing ministry. They'd have a permanent location for the first time in 6 years. And that unlocked a generosity shared across the church where they raised over $500,000 more to secure the house they are currently running their programming out of off Beach and Slater. Common Ground's story isn't done, just like ours isn't done. But what we learn is you can draw a straight line from the full devotion of committed disciples in Huntington Beach directly to visible kingdom impact in this city. When we contribute, things happen that alter the physical and spiritual landscape of our community. In the past year, we've also seen an increasing devotion in the attendance of our community. This last ministry year, we recorded an average attendance of 425 adults, along with 129 kids and 50 youth. That amounts to 10% growth as compared to the prior year. But those statistics don't tell our present story as a Branches community, because these last several months of the summer have seen the highest numbers of attendance in our entire 13-year history. Just last month, we had an adult attendance of 550 alongside 190 kids. That's around 40% higher than the regular attendance of the year prior. Realistically, there are Sundays where we are hitting the limits of our infrastructure at the Senior Center, even as we're just scratching the surface of our potential impact to the culture of this city and our reach for the sake of the gospel. That's why we commissioned a building committee made up of staff and volunteers who are presently active in looking for a facility to suit our needs on into the future. Please join us in prayer for God's direction as we search. Quite frankly, we've seen how a space, a place in this city, can be catalytic as a tool for outreach. Just consider our youth ministry. I shared with you that their weekly attendance average was about 50 youth over the course of this last year. But just last week, on a summer Sunday morning, there were 80 youth at that gathering. And this is before launching our regular midweek meetings on Wednesdays in the school year, which typically surpass our weekend attendance. Understand with me that this is a demographic that is largely disappearing from the modern church, and yet this part of our ministry just keeps expanding. I hope we understand together just how significant what I'm talking about really is. I mean, I have pastors coming to me, they're saying, "How are you doing it? How is that happening at Branches? How can we make that same thing happen? And as always, like we learned in 1 Corinthians, it's God who brings the growth. But He's using invested parents. He's using an unbelievable team of committed leaders and staff. He's using the youth who are being equipped to reach out to their classmates at their schools. And He's using the investment that we made together to secure this warehouse space. This space has enabled our youth ministry to have the room to grow and thrive. Thank you to all who gave and who continue to give with confidence in the work God is doing among us, and who make these gatherings I'm talking about possible every single week. Now, on that topic of finances, let me take you through some of the practical numbers as it relates to our budget last year and as we look ahead. At the start of the year, we had budgeted giving at $1,680,000 and budgeted expenses in the amount of a little over $1.8 million. Our actual expenses came in just under budget at $1,818,000. But the amazing thing to note is that our total giving for the year ended up being $1,913,000, which was 14% over our initial projections for the year. Instead of our projected drawdown, that increase in giving enabled us to not only meet our expenses, but give that additional $100,000 to Common Ground and break just about even for the year. We believe that had a lot to do with the communal response to the series we did on money entitled True Wealth. In fact, if you look at November 2023, after we concluded our series, we saw a truly stunning 64% growth compared to the year prior, the November prior. I want to commend you as a church community that you did not just hear God's word, but followed through on what you heard in those teachings on into obedience. We demonstrated we are a community that does what God calls us to do. And what we saw last year is exactly the kind of response we require as we look to the future and as we continue to take ground for God's kingdom here in Huntington Beach. On that topic, and looking ahead to this coming year, we have projected expenses increasing for our community as we consider the effects of inflation, and as we look several months ahead to the expiration of our initial lease terms and a potential renewal of our warehouse space here off Vincent Circle. We're also beginning to anticipate later in the year the additional costs associated with potentially moving us completely, youth, midweek programs, and our Sunday services into one central location. As we look ahead, we did not project an increase in giving akin to what we saw over the course of this last year, but we do expect to see a continued trend of financial growth, especially given that our attendance has increased. So we've come to numbers of projected giving and expenses equal at $2,032,000. Now, what has been surprising for all of us is that since this fiscal year has begun, we've actually seen the opposite trend of what we had been expecting. Giving is down, and we're already operating at a $40,000 deficit since July 1, and we're trailing our annual projections by 23%. Even more surprising is that July giving was down 22% from the year prior before we went through our study in True Wealth. After a massive year of growth, we have now dropped beneath the baseline of the year prior. So we started with a lot of generosity and enthusiasm in November of last year, and that has slowly tapered down to a level lower than before, even as we've grown significantly in the amount of adults, children, and youth in attendance every Sunday. What's the solution for us? A sustained commitment on the part of every believer in this community to contribute regularly, sacrificially, in a way that honors God and in a way that prioritizes His work in this city. We just gotta make a decision about what sort of church we're gonna be. Are we going to be one that increasingly loads the responsibility on an increasing few? Or are we going to be the church that takes up our shared responsibility, that bands together for the strengthening of us all and the expansion of God's work? If you look at the numbers, we have an unbelievable amount of potential. Our stats tell us that our largest giving group, 40% of our givers, give less than $100 a month. This is something I mentioned in last week's message. In fact, the average giving of that group, our largest group of givers, is $34 a month. An additional 38% of our congregation gives somewhere between $100 to $499 a month. If you consider the median income of our area, it appears that 40% of our congregation is giving not even near 0.5% of their annual income, and that the next 38% in that giving category are giving somewhere between 1 to 3% of their annual income. And that sort of giving constitutes nearly 80% of our givers here in the Branches community. Now, we know that some live below the median income of Huntington Beach, others are high above it. But if we're working with just the averages of our city and we all gave 10%, we're talking the initial biblical standard, our budget would triple overnight. A facility to accommodate our growing needs would be easy for us to acquire. And our first fruits budget would likely constitute the biggest fund for giving in the city to further future churches, our partner ministries, and to help those who are struggling financially. All of that would be possible without us even adding a single more person in attendance. So we need to figure this out as a church family, particularly as we come to a crossroads with our warehouse lease of Vincent Circle. We should be preparing funds to be able to navigate the costs of developing a future facility while continuing to invest in works beyond ourselves, not draining our cash reserves like we are currently. Something could come up any day, and when it does, it could be the one and single opportunity that we'll have for some time, given that our search radius for a home is not Orange County. It's a commitment to this particular region we've been ministering in Huntington Beach. Now, maybe some of you are comfortable, you're satisfied to host weekend gatherings where we've run out of parking and people just can't park. Or maybe you're comfortable that the kids' classrooms are going to be so full that we've got to turn families away. But I'm not comfortable with that. I don't know of other churches in this city, even in this county personally, in the momentum and blessing that we're enjoying on a weekly basis today. It's our shared responsibility. That's all of us to steward and invest in this work together, because our mission is nothing short of the transformation of this whole city, our culture, the individuals and families here, our youth, and to create a new reality for the next generation we're raising up in Huntington Beach. That's why we're stepping into a vision for this year we're calling Revive All. Revival is often thought as something like a lightning bolt that God sends upon His church at unexpected times. I'm convinced revival is something God is always encouraging. He's constantly encouraging, and it's God's people at certain times and places who awake to it and join with Him together. That's why we want to inspire every single believer in Huntington Beach, in every congregation and church. We want to inspire them to become awakened and alive to the work God is leading us to do today. That's what this year is about. That's what this series over the next month is about. Now, revival is really only revival if it involves all of us. Not one foot in, not one foot out, half-hearted, half invested, half the congregation, but all of us giving it all. My brothers and sisters of Branches, we've got this one life. We are this one generation in Huntington Beach. We've got this limited time to live it all for the Lord. Let's seize the opportunity to live fully awake and be fully alive to the calling He has upon us together.